Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to episode 2 of Lost Cemeteries, a podcast series where we uncover the hidden histories of Newcastle's forgotten graveyards. In this episode, we'll take you back to the very first graveyard in Newcastle, the burial ground at Christ Church, high on the hill where the Anglican Cathedral now stands. From 1804, this site became the resting place for convicts, soldiers, settlers, and many of the city's earliest pioneers. For decades, thousands were buried here, yet today, most Novocastrians know it simply as Cathedral Park, a peaceful green space with sweeping views over the harbour and suburbs. Society member Jane Ison will share the story of this rare urban burial ground, its history, its decline, and the work of researchers who have pieced together the lives of those interred there. So join us as we uncover the hidden past beneath Newcastle's Cathedral Rest Park.
From 1996, the Newcastle Family History Society began to reconstruct the burial records for 5 lost Newcastle graveyards. Often very little information had survived other than headstone transcriptions for the first Wallsend Cemetery, the North Waratah graveyard at St Andrew's Anglican Church in Mayfield, and the 3 burial grounds near Cottage Creek in Newcastle West, often incorrectly referred to as a single cemetery. In about 2008, the Newcastle Family History Society widened the scope to include an investigation and transcription of the parish registers recording baptisms, marriages and burials at Christ Church, Newcastle. In this Lost Cemeteries series, I will outline the research undertaken by Newcastle Family History Society into these now disappeared burial grounds. I will explain where they were, their history, what happened to the monuments once erected within them, and what researchers over the years have been able to uncover about those who are buried there. This podcast is the second in the Lost Cemeteries series and will focus on interments in Newcastle's very first graveyard, now a park adjoining the Christ Church Anglican Cathedral resting on the hill above the city. As the podcast focuses on the graveyard attached to the church, little of the history of the cathedral is included. For a comprehensive history and description of the Cathedral Church of Christ the King, please listen to the Newcastle Family History Society podcast, written and presented by our member Ian Eckford. Christ Church was Newcastle's first cemetery, predating by about 40 years the 3 honeysuckle burial grounds near Cottage Creek that no longer survive. Christchurch Graveyard is the last resting place of many early citizens of Newcastle. Most Novocastrians are aware of its existence, but not necessarily of its history. It is a rare example of a burial ground in an urban city environment containing undisturbed burials dating from the convict era, and is one of the oldest that is still accessible and undeveloped. The grounds may be accessed by the public, having been resumed by the Newcastle Council in 1966 and converted into a rest park, now known as Cathedral Park or Cathedral Rest Park. It is a rare example of a converted cemetery. The extensive landscaped park begins to the north of the cathedral and runs down the hill towards the city of Newcastle, ending in what is now King Street. It boasts stunning, almost 360-degree views across the city, the harbour, the ocean and the suburbs to Newcastle's west. The park covers a total area of 0.94 hectares and is bounded by King Street, Wolfe Street, the Christ Church Cathedral grounds and the Newcastle Club grounds. The central section, with an area of 0.7 of a hectare, was the original burial ground and has a frontage to King Street. The western section was the site of the former Mullenbar Cottage and has an area of nearly 1/4 of a hectare and frontages to King and Wolfe Streets. A fall of 20 metres from the high point of the cathedral to King Street means that all pedestrian access from the lower side of the park is steep. During recent years, work in Cathedral Park included the construction of new steps throughout the site, and many of those buried in the graveyard are remembered on the rises of these steps. Although a group of colliers had lived and worked in the area since 1802, Newcastle began as a place of secondary punishment for convicts who had been charged with offences in Sydney or Hobart. In 1804, Lieutenant Menzies, a few soldiers, 2 civil officers and a handful of convicts, most of whom were involved in the Castle Hill riot, was sent from Sydney, and the settlement was initially named Kingstown. Governor King requested that Menzies observe Sunday prayers in the new community, and the military followed this direction. In 1812, there remains an unsubstantiated report that a slab building had been set aside as a place for Sunday worship, which the convicts were required to attend. At this date, Newcastle's population was less than 200. The burial ground was officially proclaimed by the Commandant, Captain James Wallace, in 1817, when a 1.42 hectare site on the slope north of the cathedral was set aside for burials and was fenced off. The size of the area allocated was reduced over time by changes to the physical environment of the area. It is important to remember that in 1817, none of the streets we recognise today existed, or if they did, they went by different names. Between 1822 and 1823, Henry Dangar surveyed the town. He designed the layout of Newcastle and named Church, King, Wolfe and Newcommon streets, and the size of the burial ground was reduced at this time. A formal declaration of the burial ground did not take place until the 16th of July, 1863, nearly 50 years after it was established, and by that time the ground was smaller again. In 1869, King Street was lowered and levelled by the council, and a stone retaining wall was constructed on the northern boundary of King Street. Access to church land was limited to a gap in the wall where the church was expected to build a set of stairs. Anecdotal comments on social media report that prior to the wall's construction, bones were frequently exposed due to erosion, and that these stairs were only built during the 20th century. During the demolition and construction of the current cathedral, some graves were moved to accommodate the new building, and a part of the original cemetery, together with any graves it contained, were believed to have been lost during the construction of the Newcastle Club car park. The earliest confirmed funerals in the Newcastle area were those associated with the penal settlement and the military, although Huntington, in his serialised history of Newcastle, reported that the old burial ground behind the cathedral was said to have received its earliest graves in 1802, when some colliers of the first settlement, who met their deaths during Dr. Mason's command, were buried there. Not everyone who died in Newcastle in the very early days of the settlement, when no formal graveyard existed, was buried in the area now known as the burial ground. Private graves were often dug in various locations, near homes or on vacant land, and their location was known only to the families of the deceased. Early locals also recount that Aboriginal people were buried in the area close to the harbour, so it is possible that there were further undocumented graves found that are now lost to time. Some of these early interments have been exposed during excavations for building construction in the Hunter Street area, which is well outside the defined area for burials, and 2 graves have been documented in the area below the Cathedral Hill. The first grave, containing a large coffin, was exposed during excavations for the construction of the former Strand Theatre in Hunter Street, which in turn had replaced the old borough markets. The theatre was later demolished to make way for the shopping precinct known as Market Square, which now also no longer exists. In an article in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate on the 13th of November 1915, recording the discovery of the coffin, it was reported that Colin Christie, a former mayor of the city, when he settled in Newcastle, said that to his own recollection, and from what he had learned from the very early settlers, the site of the old markets was never a part of the cathedral cemetery. It was probable that before that period, the bodies which had been recently resurrected had been buried in unused and convenient locations by the Aborigines and by some of the very early settlers. Regarding the discovery of the remains of what was presumably a white man, his opinion was that it was that of a soldier in service in the early period when the white population was chiefly attached to the imperial service. The Newcastle University archivist Johnny de Gravio on the 18th of November 2006 reported in a Newcastle Herald article that in an unpublished memoir by the Newcastle printer Reginald Pogonowski, it was noted that during excavations in the Borough Market area for the Falcon Printery, a small coffin with an engraved plate indicating the deceased was a child of Lieutenant John Plate was uncovered. Attempts by researchers to uncover whether this child was connected to John Loriot Platt have to date been unsuccessful. Other than these scattered finds, most burials are believed to have occurred on the site above the military barracks, but commenced even before the church was constructed. The interment usually took place with a formal marching ceremony up the hill from the barracks, which was located within what is now known as the Watt Street Hospital site. The construction of Christ Church began when the foundation stone for the first church was laid on the 1st of January 1817, on the same site as the present cathedral. This foundation stone, now badly eroded, may be viewed through a thick glass panel in the floor of the present cathedral. Christ Church was the first church to be constructed outside Sydney, and the camp commandant, Captain Wallace, supervised the building's construction. Two convicts, James Clohessy, a stonemason from County Cork, and Joseph Lycett, an artist from Staffordshire, England, assisted Wallace during the construction. During this building phase, it is said that Wallace amended the plans to increase the size of the church, and later difficulties with its stability have been partly attributed to the fact that adequate foundation work was not provided for any alterations. The first service in the church was held on Christmas Day in 1817, and this church was demolished in stages between 1822 and 1884. On 2nd of August 1818, an official ceremony to celebrate the opening of the church was conducted by the Reverend William Cowper of St Philip's Church, Sydney, who had visited Newcastle in company with Governor Macquarie for the occasion. Over the next few days, Cowper baptised at least 25 children and married 15 couples. After this date and until 1821, all religious services, including burials, were undertaken by military officers. Lieutenant William Kenworthy conducted all the services and attended burials and christenings for both military and convicts between the 26th of December 1818 and the 24th of June 1821. In 1821, the Reverend G.A. Middleton was appointed as the first resident chaplain. He remained in this position until 1827. During his time in Newcastle, Middleton commenced the first Christ Church register, recording baptisms, marriages and burials. Until the opening of the Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and Wesleyan Methodist burial grounds at Honeysuckle Point near Cottage Creek during the 1840s, people of all denominations were buried in Christ Church, as it was the only burial ground in Newcastle. Until Sandgate Cemetery opened in 1881, the Christ Church burial ground continued to be used for Church of England burials. Most of the records for Christ Church have survived to the present day, and the registers of baptisms, marriages and burials in Christ Church form part of the records of the Church of England in Newcastle. The Newcastle diocese covered the area of New South Wales north from the Hawkesbury River, and the original Church of England archives are located in the University of Newcastle cultural collections. Access to these ageing documents is restricted. When the Newcastle Family History Society researchers began to compile the details in the records, however, not all were readily accessible to the wider population. Microfilms of the Newcastle Parish Registers are now available at the Newcastle City Council Library in Layman Street, Newcastle, the State Library of New South Wales, and the National Library of Australia. Most transcriptions made were based on these microfilmed copies of the baptisms, marriages, and burials of all the available 19th century registers for Christchurch, Newcastle, covering the period from the commencement of Newcastle as a penal settlement in 1804 through to 1900. Access to these registers has now considerably improved, and a digitisation program is being undertaken by the University of Newcastle. An online search for Anglican Diocese of Newcastle archives will provide researchers access to scans of the documents. The available registers were supplemented by other material, including newspapers. In 1818, Governor Macquarie had ordered that quarterly returns of baptisms, burials, and marriages be sent to the principal chaplain in Parramatta, with a duplicate copy to go to the colonial secretary. A number of these returns have survived. From his arrival in 1821 and until 1825, Middleton continued to submit quarterly returns of births, deaths, and marriages, but he also commenced the first of 4 registers for the 19th century. The first register was initially held by the New South Wales Registrar General's Department before it was transferred to State Archives, New South Wales, where it was microfilmed and released as part of the archive's records kit. The other registers held by the University of Newcastle were also transcribed. Not every deceased person in New South Wales is recorded on the New South Wales Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and if a death occurred before 1856, the only record available would be that of a burial in a church record. If a private burial occurred, or if the register did not survive, there would be no official record that the death had occurred. Researchers used the Pioneer Index of New South Wales to identify 93 Newcastle burials undertaken between 1818 and 1825, 85 of which appear in the first register. Any transcription has limitations, and an analysis of the registers uncovered errors in numbering made at the time by the original ministers. Transcribers should always record names as written in the original record, and difficulties of handwriting interpretation, defining the meaning of often individualised abbreviations used by the ministers, and to interpret names and spelling where potential accents of those involved caused mistranscriptions, always creates confusion. Because Newcastle was a port city with many shipwrecks, it could also be expected that there would be quite a number of unknown burials due to the lack of the ability to identify drowning victims. Between 1804 and 1884, approximately 3,352 interments took place in the burial grounds of the church. Many persons of historical importance, including the architect of the cathedral, John Horbury Hunt, the first Bishop of Newcastle, William Tyrrell, and the first Mayor of Newcastle, James Hannell, are interred in the cemetery. The first documented burial in the area was that of Archibald Scott in 1804. Lieutenant Menzies gave the deceased a public burial in the vicinity of what was to become the site of the Christchurch burial ground. Scott's death was reported in the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser on Sunday, the 29th of April 1804. It reported, "A melancholy accident happened to one of the seamen belonging to the Resource during her stay at Hunter's River. A musket loaded with duck shot that had so often misfired as to be declared totally useless, at last went off unexpectedly, lodging the whole charge in the head of Archibald Scott, who shortly after expired.
Newspaper reports also mentioned burials at Christchurch between 1804 and 1818. On 30th of July 1816, the colonial brig Elizabeth Henrietta capsized in Newcastle Harbour, resulting in the loss of 2 lives. Although the ship was soon refloated, the captain's wife, identified only as Mrs. Ross, and one of the crew, named Patrick Fitzgerald, who were both below deck, were drowned, and at a public funeral they were interred in Christchurch Cemetery. Many burials at Christchurch had maritime connections. On the 12th of July 1866, the Kawara, en route from Sydney to Brisbane and Rockhampton, was wrecked on the Oyster Bank, which now forms part of the foundation of the northern breakwater of the Port of Newcastle. The steamer carried 62 passengers and crew, and all bar one drowned. The Newcastle Chronicle reported on the first of the funeral processions, stating,
"The interment of the majority of the bodies took place on the 15th in the Church of England burial ground, Newcastle. Business was entirely suspended. Every shop was closed and flags hung half-mast high from the ships in the harbour. The funeral procession, starting from the hospital, consisted of some 1,500 people, and from 4,000 to 5,000 were about the hospital and the streets leading to the churchyard. The coffins were covered with flags, and each dray was escorted by 2 of the Naval Brigade, 1 on each side. The procession moved along Watt Street and Church Street to the church, the artillery firing minute guns from the barracks square. On arriving at the church, the bodies were taken out and laid in a semicircle, surrounded by the mourners. After the burial service, the bodies were then borne on the shoulders of the Naval Brigade to the grave, with the volunteer artillery commanded by Captain Macpherson in a line.
over the period of 4 days, a total of 36 people from the wreck were buried in the mass grave, and the monument erected to their memory was paid for by public subscription. A comparison of the passenger list of the Kawara and the burials in the burial ground between the 15th and 18th of July 1866 show that a very large number of those drowned were unidentified Chinese, potentially making their way to the goldfields in Queensland. The most substantial monument in the burial ground stands in the centre of the upper section of the site and rests on church land rather than on council land. This monument to James and Mary Hannell is the only monument still located in its original position. Hannell was the son of 2 convicts and had been born in Parramatta. After moving to Newcastle, he was significant in the development and progress of the city. Hannell died on the 31st of December 1876. His funeral procession was large.
Shortly after 4 o'clock, the funeral procession moved from Maryville, the late residence of the deceased, in Wickham. The respect in which Mr. Hannell was held may be inferred from the fact that, in addition to the relatives and immediate friends of the deceased, more than 200 persons on foot, on horseback or in carriages, over 20 in number, followed the coffin from Wickham to the cemetery. As the cortege moved through the town, many joined the ranks of mourners, and the pavement was lined with thousands of spectators. Amongst those present were hundreds of visitors from the mining townships, to whom the deceased was well known, and to whom his name will ever be as familiar as a household word.
Hannell's wife, Mary Ann Sophia, outlived him, dying in December 1884, after the burial ground had been officially closed. She was buried with her husband at Christchurch on the 19th of December 1884, and her funeral was also large.
The coffin was met at the entrance to the church by the Reverend Mr. Dixon, and after the conclusion of the service, the deceased lady's remains were conveyed to the grave. All the flags in the harbour and the city were half-mast, and the hearse was followed by a funeral cortege several hundreds of yards in length, extending at one point from Perkins Street as far as Bolton Street.
Immediately behind the coffin walked a procession of nearly 70 children and immediate relatives of Mrs. Hannell. Following them, a string of private carriages, buggies, and people on horseback swelled the ranks. The attendants, including high and low, rich and poor, young and old, of every age and religious denomination. At the grave, the scene was solemn and impressive.
Because Mary was buried in the graveyard after it had been closed, she was one of the cases of burials after the closing date, usually where the deceased person, while living, had expressed a wish to be buried with other family members. These burials were frequently associated with litigation and controversy, and Mary's was no exception. At least one headstone from Christchurch is known to have survived. It is composed of Scotch granite and is inscribed,
Archibald Clunes Innes, Esquire of Lake Innes, Port Macquarie, late Major, 3rd Regiment of Buffs, 6th son of James Innes, Esquire, of Thrumster, Scotland, born 14th of May 1800, died, deeply lamented and beloved by the poor and humble, on the 29th of August 1857, looking for the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ unto eternal life.
Innes was buried in the Christchurch burial ground in 1857. He was appointed commandant in charge of the penal settlement in Port Macquarie in 1826, before moving to a further appointment in Parramatta in 1827, where he married. He sold his military commission and settled in the Port Macquarie region, where he became a successful landowner. Glen Innes, inland from Port Macquarie, was named after him. In the financial crash of the 1840s, Innes was forced to sell everything he owned in order to avoid bankruptcy and the loss of his home. He was rescued by William Charles Wentworth, who managed to secure him a position as a magistrate in Newcastle. Innes worked in Newcastle for only a few years before dying at the age of 57. His headstone was claimed by family at the time of the clearing of the Christchurch site in the 1960s and was transferred to Port Macquarie, where it was placed beside that of his wife in Port Macquarie's historic cemetery. The cathedral and its grounds were surrounded by both private landowners and by land owned by the Australian Agricultural Company, so any expansion was impossible, yet the burial ground continued to fill. By as early as 1822, the instability of the cathedral steeple in strong winds caused it to be deemed unsafe, and in 1825, the upper tower of the church steeple was removed. Its height was reduced again in 1868 on the grounds of safety. Decades later, the original church building became so structurally unsound that it was often not used for divine worship, but construction plans were delayed because of the need for a new, larger burial ground. From as early as 1877, newspapers reported that council were
told by persons connected with Christchurch that it was impossible to put a spade in a square foot of ground in the cemetery without digging into a corpse. The present grave digger, when engaged, had always to dig a small hole at the end of the grave to deposit the human bones he found until his work was finished. He knew that in walking through the cemetery tomorrow, bones could be picked up on the surface of the ground. Reverend Gordon reported that a few days ago he was burying one of his congregation, and when looking into the grave felt something with his foot. Looking down, he saw that he was standing on a human skull.
While social media comments indicate that any construction work within the park uncovers bones, as all the bodies remain in the ground, bone fragments examined during the archaeological report proved to be from animals. The second half of the 19th century was a period of rapid growth in Newcastle, and a large number of burials date from the decade between 1860 and 1870. Prosperity was due to the growth of the port. However, this growth was not accompanied by any provision of water and sewerage services. There was no permanent water supply until the mid-1880s, and that was of such poor quality that it was unsuitable for domestic purposes. Residents were forced to depend on rainwater collected in tanks from their roofs or from wells that accessed underground water sources.
Without sewerage facilities, each household had to construct cesspits in their backyard, and initially there was no organised disposal of this waste, politely known as night soil. Residents were forced to empty their own pits by spreading the night soil over their backyards. It is very easy to see that this necessity would soon lead to the contamination of underground water supplies, given the enormous amount of night soil that the town generated. From as early as 1877, bad odours also emanated from the cathedral burial ground, and this, combined with water percolating through the cemetery into the domestic wells at the bottom of the hill, was a direct cause of morbidity. Persistent pressure by doctors and the local press finally forced the Newcastle Council into establishing a night soil disposal service during the 1880s. Eventually, in 1892, the state government established the Hunter District Water Board, and its initial task was to establish a reliable water supply. Until these improvements were implemented, however, Newcastle had an above-average mortality rate, and outbreaks of typhoid were common. Sadly, most of the victims were babies under the age of 1, and children aged between 0 and 3 make up nearly 2/5 of all burials in the Christchurch burial ground. So, as the town of Newcastle expanded, the space limitations of the burial ground, together with the risk to health arising from the proximity of burials to a large population, prompted moves to open a new general cemetery outside the city, and the public cemetery at Sandgate was finally opened in 1881. Following Sandgate's opening, burials ceased on the Christchurch site, and the decision was taken to slowly demolish the old church building to make way for the current cathedral. After 1884, with burials ending in the city, the grounds lay undisturbed. Historians recording details of significant persons interred in the Christchurch burial ground frequently also recorded headstone details. Unintentionally, they also recorded the gradual decline and decay of this historic site. In July 1887, the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate published the headstone details of 85 interments, and even at this date, erosion had badly affected many of the inscriptions. By 1951, the historian Wilf Gould published a further list of former citizens, and it was apparent that the lack of maintenance of the closed cemetery had left the burial grounds in total disarray, with headstones falling over, fences rusted away, and many graves totally disappearing. Despite periodic attempts to clean up the site, it continued to deteriorate as a result of weeds, neglect, fire, and vandalism. In the late 1950s, the future of the cemetery became the subject of increasing debate. The Newcastle City Council proposed taking over the area and converting it into a public rest area. The trustees of the church were not initially happy with this proposal, but ultimately the plan went ahead. A Newcastle City Council study in 1966 recorded that 258 gravesite memorials remained. While most burials in the graveyard would probably only have been marked by a wooden cross which disappeared in a relatively short time, the figure of 258 represents just a small sample of the at least 3,352 historical interments compiled and transcribed by the Newcastle Family History Society researchers from the various registers and other sources. After documenting the headstones and their locations within the burial ground, the cemetery was cleared to establish the rest park. Announcements were made encouraging relatives to remove and relocate family stones. No evidence of any grave relocations during the levelling of the site have been found. However, after Sandgate opened, evidence of some exhumations did occur in order to reunite husbands and wives in the new cemetery, as had occurred with the exhumation and reburial of James Steele. Machinery was then used to remove all traces of gravesite ironwork and ornamentation, and also the majority of these 258 stones. Images of the remains of the smashed memorials can be viewed by searching the Lost Newcastle Facebook page for Christchurch. Council chose to place a selection of the remaining headstones in rows on the eastern side of the park, some upright and some laid flat in the ground. This speaker personally observed how easy these flat stones made it for the council workers using ride-on mowers to maintain the grass. Wheel marks on the grave surfaces hastened their erosion. For decades, the monuments remained in that position, and by the early 2000s were in such a fragile and eroded state that they were removed into protective storage. Most are still awaiting restoration, and the plan is to ultimately relocate each stone as close to its original gravesite as possible. In 2025, when this podcast was recorded, few of the monuments had been returned to the park, although the historic, recently restored headstone of the Hannell family has been re-erected in its original dominant position just north of the cathedral. Of the monuments cleared in the 1960s, some were used for site filling or were distributed to other council areas in Newcastle. Most commonly, though, people on social media refer to their use as retaining walls in Blackbutt Reserve. An online search using the words Greg Ray and photo time tunnel will take interested readers to Greg's website, where he has outlined the location of these stones within Blackbutt and told their stories. He also includes a valuable link to a PDF by Ray Raisbeck, the former ranger at Blackbutt, who outlined where all the stones used in the landscaping at Blackbutt originated. Raisbeck was adamant that no entire stones were ever used in Blackbutt. It is important to note that Christchurch is the only cemetery mentioned in Raisbeck's letter. An online search for Newcastle City Council Cathedral Park will give those interested access to the PDF copies of the 1966 burial plan, a list of the known graves, inscriptions for the surviving headstones, the Cathedral Park Conservation Management and Interpretation Plan, and the Cathedral Park Master Plan.
The Christchurch burial ground may now be a park, but beneath the lawns lie the foundations of Newcastle's history. Convicts, soldiers, shipwreck victims, and community leaders whose lives shaped the city we know today. The Newcastle Family History Society has carefully transcribed the original registers of baptisms, marriages and burials from this first church, and these records are available as books or digital resources through the Newcastle Family History Society. Publications on Newcastle's other lost cemeteries can also be found in our online shop. Next time you visit Cathedral Rest Park, pause for a moment among the gardens and look out across the harbour. Remember the thousands who once walked these same paths and now rest quietly beneath your feet. Join us again for more podcasts in this series, Lost Cemeteries, on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.